You have to be in control of your emotions. You have to take a step back and you have to go, I'm not going to react. This person is pressuring me. They're saying these things. My natural tendency is to react, get my back up and bite back. No, I'm going to step back and I'm going to go, what's going to make them shut the fuck up? What's going to make them get out of my life? What's going to get rid of them? What's going to defeat them? If they're an adversary. I made that decision not to react, to get emotional. All right, now I have to think. If I do this, they're going to react this way. But if I surprise them with this angle, they won't know what to do, and then they'll react in a different way, and I'll be in control of the situation. I strategize. I go through a process of gaming out the possibilities here, and that's to be a strategist. Most of us, the 95% of us who aren't sharks, and I'm including myself in that category, it's very, very disturbing to suddenly enter that world and see all of that invisible power games on that no one's given you any advice for or helped you. And so take it out of the realm of it's just about trying to dominate the world and manipulate and exploit and abuse. It's something inside of you. You have this need, and your suppression of it will only make you come out in passive ways. And you won't be able to control certain things. If you want to move people, if you want them to follow your ideas, if you want them to be more aligned with your politics or your ideas, you have to be subtle. You have to learn psychology. You have to learn certain aspects of how to almost move people without them realizing in certain directions, which is like the art of seduction. And if you're not interested in that, if you're just going to tell people what you think and what you're going to do, that means you're not interested in practical action. You're not interested in results. You're just interested in venting your own frustrations or your own anger. So learning the subtle little dynamics of power is extremely essential because we're a social animal. It doesn't mean that you're going to get dirty, that you're going to suddenly go out there and manipulate the hell out of people. Most of the 48 laws of power is about defense. But how to defend yourself from the sharks about there, how to defend yourself from making classic mistakes, like outshining the master, like talking too much, like arguing with people instead of demonstrating your ideas, on and on and on. It's not an ugly thing. It actually makes you a better social individual. So that's how I like to frame it.
It's very interesting. I think as a young guy growing up, it was so important to me to know where I fit in with my friend group. And I didn't think of it so much as a hierarchy, nor when I was in my academic studies did I think of it as a hierarchy, even though it clearly was, right? So much as the goal was to figure out where was my unique slot that I could do the most good for myself and others.
Right.
Kind of finding my spot. I don't want to say on a shelf because it gives an image of something vertical, but let's make it lateral, lateral arrangement of different people with different strengths, different life purposes, trying to figure them out. Where should I be in order to express that and also feel connected to others? And in order to do that, I realize now, based on your answer, I did have to figure out, who's trying to have power over, who's pretending that they don't want power but is actually exerting power, these sorts of things. And there's an incredible peace that comes from knowing that one is in the correct place, both profession, interpersonally, in relation to oneself, but also in the context of one's peer group. It's kind of knowing, this is where I belong. Because trying to gain power when one is trying to move to a position that isn't right for them or in a way that isn't right for them just seems so energetically costly.
Yeah.
Seems like a waste of a life, frankly.
Right.
Trying to gather resources simply to have them, to give the illusion of power, but then being afraid of losing them just sounds like a recipe for misery, as you pointed out.
Yeah.
Whereas figuring out where am I most powerful in the benevolent sense of the word, that seems like a good pursuit.
Well, it's connecting up to mastery again and finding your life's purpose. I knew when I was young that I couldn't exert physical power because I was a skinny little runt, and I wasn't bullied, but people would kind of pick on me, et cetera, et cetera. So I veered towards intellectual pursuits where I could have power. And in the end, you might have been a jock and you might have done well in high school, but look at me now. I'm not saying that it's a beautiful thing. But that's part of human nature, the desire to actually, prove yourself and find that niche that you belong to, so you don't have that kind of that sense of inferiority, which Alfred Adler, the psychologist, describes very eloquently. So a lot of it is kind of compensating when you're a child for things that are your weaknesses and finding what you're so good at that you do have that power and people can't bully you, right? And you're like now a famous neuroscientist, whereas they're like, who knows what they're doing kind of thing. So power definitely is connected in some way to that inner sense of what you were meant to do. And you feel it with the ease and the connection that comes from it, right? So I can honestly say that my dislike of working for other people and office politics and egos, I now have an existence where I don't have to deal with any of that. And I'm so blessed, and I wake up every morning and I pray to God, thank God I found this, because it's the perfect lifestyle for me.
Yeah, can be accurately described as an intellectual beast. So it's which is like a compliment, right? We hear the word beast and we think a ferocious beast trying to harm others. But
I'm happy being a beast.
Yeah, and so I think finding where we can be a beast, and for some people that's painting or gardening or whatever it might be. I think is again ties back to these issues of or this quest for mastery. Seduction is also a very loaded word, right?
It's even more uglier than power.
Because seduction kind of drips with the idea that somebody is tricking someone else into doing something that they otherwise would not want to do. But seduction is both our propensity to do it and to have it done to us is hardwired into our nervous system and has a lot to do with the hypothalamus and a bunch of other areas that I won't bore us with the nomenclature. But seduction, to me, implies some sort of exchange. I suppose we could seduce ourselves through denial or convincing ourselves that of something. But more often than not, when we talk about seduction, we're talking about an interaction between two or more people. So what are some of the core principles of seduction? And if you care to play anthropologist a bit and a neuroscientist, I would invite that. Why do you think we have neural circuits in our brain that allow us to seduce and be seduced?
Well, I don't know how if I'm being kind of an armchair intellectual here, but my theory is some of it has to go back to social events long in our prehistory, which have to do with taboos. And society was initially kind of organized by a series of taboos, right? Most notably the taboo on incest. And what happened, this is just not my theory, it's the theory of the Malinowski is that I pronounce it, is that the moment a taboo enters the human brain, like you're not supposed to sleep with this woman, the desire arises inside of you to actually sleep with that woman. The sense of no, the sense that this is prohibited, stirs the desire, stirs the contrary impulses in humans. And we can be very, perverse creatures, right? So if you've ever tried to suppress a thought, you'll realize that it keeps coming up. It keeps coming up. You can't suppress it. Don't think of an elephant, Andrews. Whatever you do, don't think of an elephant. You're thinking of it because you can't help it, right? The idea that you're not supposed to desire this person stirs that actual desire. So I believe the sense of something being taboo and transgressive is the ultimate kind of origin of our desire for seduction. But seduction involves vulnerability. It involves somebody gets inside, somebody gets under our skin, right? And to do that, we have to let them in. So the person being seduced is in some ways to a degree complicit. Because if you just put up a wall and you said, no, I'm not going to be seduced, nothing will happen. But you have a vulnerability. You're letting that person into your psyche, into your inner space. The paradigm for that is early childhood. So Freud talks a lot about this. So I don't know if people still believe in Freud anymore.
I certainly do.
Okay.
Absolutely.
But
genius of both psychology and physiology. Wrong
sure.
about a lot of things, did a lot of things he shouldn't have done. Let's acknowledge that. I think everyone would agree that sleeping with your patients and being a cocaine addict, bad ideas. But at the same time, he had an absolute, like near supernatural levels of insight and brilliance into human nature.
Did he sleep with his patients?
I believe he did. But if I just threw that on him without him doing it, then, forgive me.
He certainly had emotional attachments to his patients that he shouldn't have had. I don't know if he slept with them. He very well might have. But his idea was that the child is seduced by the parent. You're in an extremely vulnerable position, right? Your life depends on them. And they're seducing you with their energy. You're letting them in, right? And that kind of creates a pattern for the rest of your life. And so, for instance, the feeling of being carried by your father and just being taken around physically is a form of seduction, because you don't know what he's going to do to you. You're very excited. You want that surprise, right? And to me, it's related to the seduction of a story. Stories are very seducing to us. We don't know where they're taking us. We don't know what the next chapter is, what's going to happen to this character or not. The surprise lowers our resistance and opens our mind up to what's going to happen next. Is a form of seduction. Fairy tales, the stories you were reading as a child, your interactions with your parents, they're deeply, deeply ingrained in you. You cannot be seduced unless you are vulnerable, right? And so I like to switch it around and get it out of the negative connotations. Being vulnerable is actually a positive trait. I think a lot of people now in the world today, because things are so harsh and invasive, that people have become too invulnerable. They don't want to let anything in, right? And this now infects their relationships with other people. They don't want to be influenced. They want to be strong inside of themselves. They're afraid of giving in to the other person, of surrendering to their influence. But it's actually a delightful feeling to surrender to the power of another person and then reverse that charge and have them surrender to your power. So when I'm reading a writer, and sometimes they completely seduce me, like Friedrich Nietzsche is one of my favorite writers. I let go of everything. I let him enter my brain, and I'm completely seduced. I let him lead me along. But then I encounter writers that I don't like at all. I'll mention one, it's probably not a good thing, but Steven Pinker. I don't like Steven Pinker. I find him really annoying, okay? But I force myself to try and find a way to be seduced by him, to let him into my brain, to see where he's coming from, to open myself to the possibility that he could be correct. So vulnerability, letting people into your mental space, is a form of intelligence. It's a kind of an emotional and an intellectual intelligence.
And forgive me for interrupting, but I think it also implies a level of confidence, because empathy, or allowing oneself to be vulnerable to the point where you're seduced by something, by definition, if you're choosing to do it, implies that you also have the confidence that you can get back to yourself afterward.
Of course.
Right? That you're not going to get lost in the circumstances. That you're not going to be hijacked to the point of no return.
Right.
Or in some way that's detrimental to you.
That's right.
So it's sounding really nerdy here. It's collinear with confidence in many ways. Sure, like take my mind and take it where you will, because I know I can come back at any time.
Right, right. And the same thing in a physical seduction, in a romantic sense, right? You're opening yourself up to the charm, to the energy of the other person. But if they start displaying dark energy and you see that they're abusive or something is wrong, you have the ability to retreat.
Well, there it gets tricky.
It gets very tricky.
Well, because the attachment systems, which are also rooted in childhood, oftentimes can overwhelm one's ability to recover oneself. How many, if I had $1 for every time someone that I knew in my life saying, like, I know they're bad for me, but I just can't, we just can't seem to disengage. Like that, you hear about that all the time. I mean, you see court cases about this that are public, and you just go, why didn't they just walk away from one another? Well, because once those attachment systems are locked in, it almost becomes, and here metaphorically speaking, like a parent-child relationship. Like you can't suddenly decide your parents weren't your parents,
right,
simply because you know better now. Right? You are forever stricken with the reality that they were, and they had an influence. And I think that attachment system is a force that tugs pretty hard.
Yeah, and a lot of women have written to me since The Art of Seduction, sort of saying that their boyfriend or husband was applying some of these tactics on them, and it was very painful, and they were kind of a little bit angry at me for it. But then they kind of realized that they didn't learn it really from my book. It was already kind of wired in them. But that reading about these tactics and these strategies actually helped them to recognize what their husband or boyfriend was doing to them, the manipulation and the games that were being played.
Do men write to you and talk about the seductive adornments that women have used to bring them into relationship as well, or are you typically hearing from women?
I mostly hear from women complaining about men and how they've abused them and how they used some of the strategies. I don't deny have a slightly nefarious edge to them, because I didn't want to write a book about seduction that doesn't have that taboo element, because I say seduction involves the taboo, and I didn't want to censor myself.
But female to male seduction clearly also exists.
Very much
it's
so.
less often. I acknowledge that it's less often is it physically abusive, but right. I mean, from an early age, both boys and girls, men and women, are coached by society on the sorts of seductive tactics and adornments, right? I mean, everything from makeup, perfume, hairstyles, cars, watches, jewelry, expression, power displays of any kind. I mean, that stuff, the world's filled with that stuff.
Yeah, but men are generally kind of happy when a woman seduces them, right? Unless they're after their money or something like that, which happens. But generally the sense, I talk about this in the first chapter about sirens, which I say is the quintessential archetype of the female seductress, the kind of half human, half bird creature on a rock singing so beautifully that you have to jump in the water and then they kill you. And so the idea is that men want to let go because men have to be so in control, so powerful. They have to project this image. They have a secret desire to let go and be almost dominated by a very powerful woman. A lot of men have that. And I talk about some of the most powerful men in history: Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, Joe DiMaggio, all these men, very masculine men who've fallen for very feminine, siren-like women and been completely dominated by them. And they actually kind of enjoy the process because it's like a sense of, I can let go. I can enter this totally sensual physical world, and it's extremely pleasing. It's like another realm outside of my kind of cold, masculine world, So I don't really get men complaining too much about women who've seduced them, honestly. It's usually the other way around.
I'd like to take a quick break and thank our sponsor, Inside Tracker. Inside Tracker is a personalized nutrition platform that analyzes data from your blood and DNA to help you better understand your body and help you reach your health goals. Now, I've long been a believer in getting regular blood work done for the simple reason that many of the factors that impact your immediate and long-term health can only be analyzed from a quality blood test. Now, a major problem with a lot of blood tests out there, however, is that you get information back about metabolic factors, lipids, and hormones, and so forth, but you don't know what to do with that information. With Inside Tracker, they make it very easy because they have a personalized platform that allows you to see the levels of all those things, metabolic factors, lipids, hormones, etc., but it gives you specific directives that you can follow that relate to nutrition, behavioral modification, supplements, etc., that can help you bring those numbers into the ranges that are optimal for you. If you'd like to try Inside Tracker, you can go to insidetracker.com/Huberman to get 20% off any of Inside Tracker's plans. Again, that's insidetracker.com/Huberman. I've heard before, and I promise this is not an original idea that I'm pretending to have heard elsewhere, that my friend asked me to ask sort of question, that in all sexual exchanges, there's a power exchange.
Definitely.
Maybe you could elaborate on that, because as you were describing some of the seductive power dynamics that exist, a phrase that I've heard before came to mind that at first made me chuckle, but then made me think quite deeply about this issue of the relationship between sexual and power dynamics, which is this notion of topping from the bottom. If one is giving someone else the impression that they are more powerful, by virtue of the word giving, they actually hold some power, right? Power can be given or taken, but oftentimes seductive exchanges and sexual exchanges and romantic exchanges in particular are about both people buying into a a temporary illusion. Let's pretend that you're in charge when actually I'm in charge. Okay, but I know that you think that you're in charge. Okay, let's just pretend none of that exists and just do X, right? And I think this is another example of covert contracts. And it's one that actually can potentially create a lot of problems post hoc, right? But I think the relationship between sex, romance, and power is an important area to explore in the context of this.
Well, I wrote The Art of Seduction with the idea that it was an art invented by women. It was invented by women who had no power, essentially, socially, politically, in any sense of the word, in domestically, right? But the one power that they could wield over a man was through sex, some physical attraction. And so they developed this art of kind of luring a man into their world through various theatrical effects, Cleopatra being kind of the archetype of this, and then luring the powerful man into this world. He has the illusion that he's the one pursuing her, but in fact, she is the one controlling the dynamic. So oftentimes the person who appears to be the weaker one in the relationship, who's not doing the pursuing, is actually inviting the pursuing, is actually leading the other person on. So there's a lot of kind of appearance games going on, and you can never really figure out who exactly is in control of the dynamic, because one person is like allowing the other person to lead them on, but the fact that you're allowing them is a degree of power, is a degree of control, right? So it's very hard to figure out. And sex and power and romantic relationships are very much intertwined in us, physically, emotionally, neurologically. You can't avoid it, right? And so I think it's kind of dishonest to say that none of that exists, that it's like that there's some egalitarian paradise out of there when it's really not wired in us for that kind of relationship.
There's a recent scientific publication / factoid that I wanted to share with you in this context because I'd like your thoughts on it. David Anderson, who's a phenomenal neurobiologist, he's been a guest on this podcast before. He's a professor at Caltech, studies basically the functions of the hypothalamus. So things like aggression, mating, and things of that sort, and does it with great detail. He's a virtuoso of the hypothalamus. And he published a paper 2 years ago showing that indeed there are neural circuits in the brain of animals and presumably in humans as well that control sexual mounting behavior, but that there is actually a separate circuit for purely non-sexual mounting and physical power over that's expressed in animals. And anyone that's ever owned a dog and gone to the dog park will see same-sex mounting between dogs, or mounting between dogs that has apparently no sexual endpoint.
Yeah.
And in exploring this literature and talking to David about it, it's very clear that there are neural circuits that have everything to do with essentially one animal of a species getting on top of the other animal, usually from behind, oftentimes scruffing or biting the back of the neck, and saying, I control you. It's often done in a playful context, especially between animals, not always aggressive, but there's a certain element of aggressive to it. But it essentially says, I decide whether or not you are mobile or not for this moment. And and this is very important, I want to emphasize this is a circuit that is entirely separate from all of the reflexes associated with sexual behavior in males and females. I find this to be fascinating. And because we hear about power over, right? And we hear about power and we think about physical power over. But the idea that something as primitive as mounting, just like something as primitive as biting or as striking, has its own unique set of circuits in the brain, I think substantiates everything that you put in your books about power and maybe even seduction as well. So as I just kind of toss that out there for consideration, I wonder if you have any reflections on it. If not, feel free to just say, I don't, but of course. But to me, this was a really important discovery because I think everyone looks at mounting behavior and says, oh, that has to be sexual. And sometimes it's
I see what you mean.
But it's not. That there seem to be a host of neural circuits in the brain that are really about defining who's on top, literally, that has nothing to do with sex.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. I've never read anything about that. But I can say that I wrote a chapter in my new book about love, and that's a different thing than seduction. And I was trying to come up with an idea of love that does have an element of equality, that doesn't have this power dynamic going on in it.
Oh, I love that.
And kind of like the antithesis of my art of seduction, where I'm almost contradicting myself. And I was going into the biology of it and even into the physics of it. So there's a famous French biologist whose name escapes me. Sorry, I can't remember, from the 20s and 30s. And he was studying paramecium. And he was studying them, they're in these ponds, etc. And he said that there was these moments where these single-celled organisms were suddenly coupling. They were all joining together, just one to one, and they were absorbing the membrane of one inside the other. And then they would and then once one couple did that, all the paramecium started joining up together. Then they would sink to the bottom of the pond. And paramecium don't reproduce through sex. They reproduce through dividing themselves, right? Self-reproduction. And so he was saying that the desire to couple, to connect to someone so deeply where one is absorbed in the other, is biologically wired into us. Goes back millions and millions and millions of years. And it's a desire, essentially, a biological desire for love, right? And it's an energy that permeates it's not just about power and hierarchies, and that he was showing other creatures that had something similar going on. And, in physics, we talk about entanglement, and we also talk about, matter. If matter isn't opposed by a lot of kinetic energy, it joins together. Particles join together to form matter, et cetera, et cetera. So there's something in the universe that's trying to connect things to each other. So there's this kind of energy that exists in the world where we have a deep need to connect to somebody outside of those power dynamics, right? Where there's a degree of equality, where we're drawn to each other, and we let go of the ego games, we let go of the playing, we kind of surmount our own physiology, our own hypothalamus, and we engage in this, I call it love sublime. And it involves the physical part. The sexual part is the trigger for it. Because when you have sex with someone, your body is suddenly permeable to their energy in a way that you cannot control. It releases all kinds of chemicals in the brain that are very powerful. And oftentimes that sense is too powerful and you react and you're afraid of it and you pull back. But if you don't react and you go further, then the mind also becomes permeable to the other person and their energy and their desire. And so then it kind of creates a spiraling effect where the physical and the mental connection reaches this state that I call love sublime. Now, it's an ideal. It doesn't really exist that much out there in the world today. But there are stories in history that illustrate it, and I believe that it is a biological necessity for us to feel a deep, deep sense of connection. We normally ascribe that to religion, to God, etc. But I maintain the essence of love, the model for love, is between two human beings. Straight or homosexual, doesn't matter. And that feeling of surmounting our own neurology, our own system, and entering this zone is deeply, deeply satisfying. We all want it. And it has to involve letting go of the power dynamics, and everything being equal. It's not that the other person is exactly like you. You recognize their difference. But as far as being worthy of attention, being worthy and respected, you leave all of that other stuff outside. So there is a zone that's possible that's outside this power dynamic that we're talking about.
I'm excited that you're writing about this. So this is for your next book.
Yeah.
I'm very excited. I couldn't help but think of some of the parallels between what you describe and what we're observing nowadays in the landscape of politics and social dynamics, where clearly there is no setting aside of egos. People feel both sides feel attacked. Everyone in between feels confused, like, why do I have to pick a side? And there seems to be no hint of a future where people are setting down their swords, which means, if we were to go with your earlier definition, which I like a lot, that nobody feels safe enough to be vulnerable enough to allow the union of people to occur, which is just a way of rewording, a bunch of other things, and not nearly as eloquently as you described it. But if setting aside of power dynamics and making oneself vulnerable is the key to accessing love in the romantic context, surely, but also in the societal context, I mean, what are the channels for that? I mean, I suppose there is the argument, not mine, that everyone should just take a boatload of psychedelics and see the interconnectedness of things. But that seems like an unrealistic route. I just don't see that being, 12th grade graduation curriculum. Nor do I think it would be healthy. To be clear, I think that we'd end up with a lot of expression of problems there. But short of a magic substance that could increase feelings of connectedness among everyone simultaneously, how are you going to save humanity, Robert?
Well, because I'm concerned about young people in particular with hookup culture, with pornography, et cetera, et cetera. It's kind of rewiring the human brain, and we're losing what I was just describing. And I see particularly a lot of young people, and I don't blame them because they've grown up in a world that's very chaotic and very hostile.
Could I say, I think it's, and not to be nitpicky here, but I love what you just said. I think, in my mind, things like that are hijacking the hardwiring of the brain.
Okay.
And I'm not, again, forgive me, the audience is probably going,
you can't really rewire the brain like that. So.
Well, I think we can expand and rewire upon our hardwiring, but so much of what you talk about in your books is about finding one's essence, but then also what I love about your book so much, among many other things, is that it's about that dance between the hardwiring and the possible of through effort. So anyway, forgive me for being...
No, it's very accurate.
So yeah, how do you get us out of this?
Well, you're putting a big burden on me.
I am, but I think you're up to it.
Well, I try to do it in this chapter because I wanted to seduce the reader into the idea that this is something extremely pleasurable and extremely healthy. And the feeling of being vulnerable is a very positive attribute that will infect not just your romantic relationships, but will infect you mentally. So creative people are extremely vulnerable. They're extremely vulnerable to ideas. They're extremely vulnerable to the environment. And closing yourself off into your own ego, into yourself. So the chapter is called Escape the Prison of the Ego. And you're kind of trapped inside of yourself and your own thoughts and your own desires. And it's like a prison. It's enclosing you, and you want to escape somehow. And you escape through drugs, you escape through porn, but it doesn't lead to actually escaping. You want to be able to let go of the self and get out of this prison that you're in, right? And so it's a desire that we all have. And so I wanted to frame it as this incredibly positive dynamic that you can engage in. And the ability to be vulnerable to other people, to open yourself up and to say that, yeah, they might hurt me, but I'm strong enough to take it. And if they hurt me, I'll learn from it and I'll rebound. And I know that's a bit naive on my part, but I want you to at least have that feeling, because a lot of young people write to me and they say, I can't fall in love anymore. I don't like that feeling. It makes the loss of control is too much. And a lot of that, their behavior patterns are in creating this sense of control, which you can have when you're locked inside of yourself.
Hence, overindulgence in pornography, and masturbation, et cetera, as a way to avoid the understandable fear about interrelational dynamics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, when you're young, you're idealistic. At least a lot of young people are, and you have these dreams and these hopes, and to let go of this possibility, which is deeply pleasurable and deeply therapeutic to the human animal as a social animal. It's like the highest form of interaction that we can have. So my strategy in that chapter was to paint such a wonderful portrayal of the pleasures that are awaiting you by letting go of your defenses, of letting go of all of your natural resistance factors and opening yourself up to other people is a key to not just a romantic relationship, but to career success, to mental energy, to creativity, to being open in general, right? And so I don't think I could have a wide, a huge impact, but we'll see when the book comes out. But I'm advocating that sense of opening yourself up to the universe, to the cosmos itself, as an energy that permeates the world. And so that you don't want to, the feeling of being closed inside of your ego, inside of yourself, I want to make it so you feel the pain of that, because you don't really feel the pain of it. You feel like it's comfortable for you. But I want to make it clear to you that it's not comfortable. It's deeply, deeply painful, and it's disconnecting you from some of the best experiences you can have in life. So I have that strategy. The only other hope I have is in the human spirit itself. So a lot of this is being caused by social media, I believe, right? And the instant and the kind of immediate gratification we can get in so many ways. And my hope is that young people get fed up and get just disgusted with all this disconnection and alienation in their life, and that they hunger from actually something more communal, more interactive, more real, as opposed to virtual. And so that the human spirit can't be completely squashed by technology, etc. So I have that hope, because we've gone through these cycles before in history where people have become very invulnerable and very locked and closed. And suddenly there's an explosion, a creative explosion, like in the 1960s, like in the 1920s, like in 18th century Europe with the Casanova, where seduction reached its kind of apogee, etc. So it has kind of swung back and forth between these moments where humans get incredibly closed and bitter and partisan, and everything's conflict and everyone's divisive, etc. And suddenly it goes in the opposite direction. I have hope in that possibility, and I structured my chapter to perhaps sweep that a little bit along that tide and see if I can have any effect.
Well, I think what you just described in conversations like it and that stem from it are likely to have a tremendous effect. I think it's exactly what's needed now. And certainly I'll be trying to amplify that message. I agree with everything you said, and not just because you're sitting here as a guest on this podcast, but because it's clear to me that while power dynamics and seduction are wired into our human relations since the beginning of time, that we have reached a very challenging period in our history. It's somewhat of a relief to me to know that it's happened before, but in a very different context. We hear a lot about the swinging back and forth of the pendulum. Someone, in fact, Peter Attia, online physician's brother, actually said, so we'll credit him. He said, no, it's not a pendulum that swings back and forth. Unfortunately, now it's become a wrecking ball. So it's swinging back and forth and doing damage as it reaches its extremes. And I think that I also look forward to a time where people acknowledge that the injustices around them and that have been done to them and others, and but somehow are able to transcend that. And the word that I'd like to pick up on there is the word justice. It was pointed out to me by someone I respect very much that, having a sense of justice is a wonderful and important thing. And as humans, it's important to how we structure society. But I do think that a lot of the negative things that we see out there nowadays have something to do with the availability of ready availability of pornography, high density calorie food, et cetera, a bunch of things like that. But that one of the issues with social media, because it does have its positive aspects, but one of the negative issues in my mind is that it's a steady flow of examples of injustice. So all day long, you're just seeing things like that piss you off and that piss other people off, and for different reasons. But what was pointed out to me is that one of the key things about a sense of injustice is to be able to determine whether or not there's anything that you should do about it. And I think that everyone now feels a bit hijacked by all the injustices we see, because we feel like, well, we're supposed to do something about it. But it may be that while we can't let every injustice pass, that being bombarded all day long with things that upset us is hijacking our creativity. It's distracting us from our deeper purpose. It's preventing a sense of vulnerability that would lead to a sense of deep love, and on and on. So I don't think it's just about the tantalizing lures of sex, food, and looking at, bodies and hearing voices on social media. I think there is some validity to that, but that it's also that, there's just ample opportunity to go down the gravitational pull forces of injustice. Like, oh, that's so frustrating. Why are they doing that? I mean, I catch myself doing that, talking to coworkers when I walk in about, did you see this thing? This is crazy. What's going on with it? They're crazy. When, as opposed to thinking about anything else in that moment. And I try and yank myself out of that. But I think that you're not going to do it alone, but I think you will play a major role in saving us from this, because I think because people just need to see themselves through a different lens and realize this is distracting me from who I'm supposed to be.
Well, a lot of what modern life should involve is the ability to ignore certain things. So, for instance, I don't know if you know that app Nextdoor.
Oh, right. I used to have it, but then I'd see all the packages being stolen off my neighbors' porches in Oakland. And then I started enjoying living in Oakland less. And I love the city of Oakland. It's got its problems. It definitely has its problems. But as an East Bay kid, and went to school out there, and, I have deep love for the East Bay, and it's always had those problems. But when you see stuff being stolen on your phone in the middle of the night when you wake up, it creates a sense that, like, they're out to get my stuff. Right. It's terrible.
Right. And so I have it in my spam filter, but I look at it, and every headline is people stealing, somebody broke into somebody's house, this dog bit me, this rabid dog going around, there's this homeless person that's yelling and attacking people, on and on and on. I feel like I'm living in this neighborhood. It's like Beirut or something in the 1980s. I can't even walk out my door. I don't look at Nextdoor anymore. I just ignore it. I don't open it ever, because I know that they're designed algorithmically to put that in front of you every single time so that you click on it, because we respond to that kind of stuff naturally. We can't help it. So you have to be able to shut that stuff up and look at what you can actually control in your life. So I have this visceral dislike of what's going on in Ukraine, because I was in Ukraine recently, and I feel I've identified very strongly with their struggle, right? And that outrage feeling, every time I read an article about it, it just drives me crazy. So the only thing is I stop reading as much as I can. I read things that are kind of rational and intelligent, and I send them money, and I donate as much as I can, and I help them practically. But I don't allow myself to get that kind of outraged feeling all of the time. So somebody has to write a book. Somebody has to instruct us in what to ignore and what to actually pay attention to. So there are things that you can control, injustices that are out there that you could control by voting, by amassing a movement, by, dealing with climate change, not by trying to recycle every little thing in your house, but actually doing something really much more macro in the world, joining a cause. There are things you can do, and that's positive, and that's a way of channeling that kind of dark energy in you for a positive purpose. But it's totally disruptive, and it totally distracts you and weakens you and drains you of energy to fall into those rabbit holes and let yourself fall into them. So you have to learn the art of what to ignore and what not to pay attention to, and understand that you're wired to see those kind of red alert buttons on Facebook or on Nextdoor or wherever they are. And it's negative. It's like a candy rush, and you have to avoid it.
And it's taking us away from our purpose, which we each have. I mean, I think to me that's the most deleterious aspect of it.
Unless your purpose is to organize and be an activist. People ask me, I wrote a lot in my Human Nature book about the shadow side of human nature, right? And we all have it. We all have a dark side. We all have hidden aggression. We all have feelings of envy. We all have feelings of grandiosity. We all have aggressive impulses. How do you deal with it? And I say the way to deal is to channel it into something positive and pro-social. And that can be putting it in your artwork, venting that anger and that outrage in something that people kind of can identify with. Or it can be in organizing something. That could be your purpose in life, in actually doing something positive. So that's the only way that you could actually use that energy for some kind of actual life's task or purpose.
You've been discussing lately a bit on some of your channels about masculine and feminine, let's say, roles, and crises of the masculine feminine dance, as well as the crisis of masculinity per se, the crisis of femininity per se. Do you care to expand on that a bit? I think we could probably take 3-4 hours to explore all this in full. But I was struck by some of the things that you said, because I agree completely that just as we are not given a roadmap when we arrive in the world as to how to find our purpose, I think there's also a very conflicted roadmap that's thrown in front of us, and indeed conflicting multiple roadmaps about what it means to be masculine or feminine or some combination of both, which of course everybody is some combination of both, just to varying degrees.
Well, yeah, so men have a feminine side to them, which if you try to repress it will come out in other ways. And women have a masculine side to them. I think Jung described this very well with the anima and the animus, which I think is extremely real. It's very, very confusing times for both men and for women right now. We don't know the roles that they're everything is just so fluid, and it's very, very difficult, particularly if you're young. So young women are getting this idea that everything should be equal and that women should have, and of course it's right, should be paid the same and should have the same career opportunities. There should be no prejudice or harassment or anything. But at the same time, on social media, it's all about looking perfect, and looks are incredibly important. And if you're not hot, you're in terrible trouble. And a lot of young girls are extremely confused by this. They're getting mixed signals, right? And boys are even in perhaps even worse circumstance where being masculine is seen as something negative. So we don't have any ideals out there anymore of what constitutes a good positive form of femininity and a good positive form of masculinity. In fact, we even think that there shouldn't be anything like that there's no such thing as being masculine or feminine or whatever. It's very, very confusing. And so, I think of masculine traits that I think are very positive and that should be out there to kind of counteract the sort of Andrew Tate seduction that a lot of young men are falling for. And it's a kind of an inner strength where you're sort of in control of your emotions. You're not invulnerable, et cetera, et cetera. But you can take criticism. You can take you can have moments of failure and you'll bounce back. But you have a kind of inner resilience and a kind of inner strength, a kind of a quiet calm that I think used to be exemplified in movie icons like a Gary Cooper type thing, right? And that kind of sense of inner calmness where you're not hysterical, you're not getting upset about everything that happens, where you have a kind of an inner strength and a confidence, and you can withstand kind of what Ryan Holiday talks about a lot about with stoicism. You can withstand all of the hardships in life, but you have that citadel within you, is a very, very powerful form of masculinity, as opposed to it's all about sleeping with a lot of women, having really fast cars, being abusive and being a bully, et cetera, et cetera. These are signs of weakness, of insecurity. And to be masculine should be a sense of security and inner confidence and inner strength, right? And that's what we should venerate in our culture, and we should have icons like that, okay? It doesn't mean that there's no role for men who are not masculine or who have more of the feminine virtues. There's definitely a role for that. And, we see a lot of that in all sorts of arenas of life. And then there should be a positive model for women, where instead of their appearances being judged by their appearances and having to conform to the ideals of what's hot or not, it's about being incredibly powerful and competent and have expertise and being really successful in your career and as opposed to being continually judged by your appearances, which is very damaging. So these are terrible times. I mean, I feel fortunate that I grew up in a time where there were these kind of models for me to go by. And I think of my father who who was a very quiet man, and he was just a middle-class salesman is basically what he was. He just sold for all his whole life. He sold chemical supplies for one company. But he was very dignified. He treated people well. He was very calm and very quiet, but he also was very empathetic. That was my role model for what I think is a good masculine energy. And I think a lot of people just don't have that, and they're very lost. And so I don't know what the answer is to that. I can't really produce that out of thin air, but I wish I could.
Well, certainly nowadays there are many more, let's say, examples and options of masculine and feminine qualities out there for observation because of social media and because of the internet. And as you pointed out before, a key feature to becoming a functional human being, especially nowadays, is learning what to ignore.
Yeah.
I mean, there's an interesting idea in the circles around nutrition and health that, never before in human history have human beings been able to access such a wide variety of foods that differ from what their ancestors ate. And I don't even mean ancient ancestors. I mean, if you grew up in the Bay Area, as I did in the 1970s and 80s, there were a few ethnic restaurants, but we ate the same, 15 or 20 foods over and over again.
Right.
And then eventually that exploded into dozens of options and more, and fusion foods and all sorts of things. And so there is this idea in the nutrition communities that we are not hardwired to think about and discern so many different food options that, and to taste so many distinct flavors, whereas before people in one portion of the planet or country ate generally one way in a given season, if there's seasonality, et cetera, et cetera. In a similar vein, we are now, and children too are now overwhelmed with the number of different options of how to express oneself, both masculinity and femininity, but generally speaking. And so the question is then, how does one choose? Right? How does one decide what's functional, what works, what's best, what's me, right? Everyone asking themselves, who am I, right? I think all teenagers, I find this fascinating, ask themselves, who am I? Adults don't tend to ask themselves that question,
right.
But who am I?
I still ask myself that
Okay,
question.
well, that's good. Maybe I should ask myself that more often. But I think that we clearly have gone over a cliff with this stuff. I don't think we're still at the point where we're kind of veering towards the edge of confusion. I think young people are really confused because the moment one assumes one clear and, let's say, balanced set of masculine, feminine attributes, or maybe veers a bit more masculine or a bit more feminine, it's like there are a million examples telling you that that's wrong.
I know.
And then sometimes has the tendency to anchor to, well, no, I'm right because this is who I am. And then all of a sudden you're in a larger battle. So, Gary Cooper's great. Love his movies. But we now have a million variations on Gary Cooper, that don't look anything like the Gary Cooper you and I are talking about. And a lot of people won't even know who we're talking about.
I know they won't.
Right. But that's perhaps,
I know I'm a dinosaur.
But perhaps it illustrates the point. No, not that you're a dinosaur, but that there is no single or even set of masculine or feminine ideals. So picking role models is something that I really truly internalized from your book, Mastery.
Yeah.
There were a lot of lonely years for me, and I won't get into the stories of just wondering, what am I going to do? I'm 13, my home was completely broken, no semblance of the reality it was before. Who are the males in my life I'm going to orient to? And fortunately for me, I assigned mentors to me, whether or not they knew it or not, that really helped me along. And I changed them up as you recommend. There wasn't one.
Yeah.
I understood there was a breaking up process, an integration process, combining and threading together different things. I truly believe that that's what's required. It doesn't have to be 100% Gary Cooper. It can be 10% Robert Greene, 10% someone else, 5% this, and creating a pie chart of sorts of, who one wishes to be in a given context. Yeah. But that takes work. It takes a bit of work and discernment, but gosh, that's powerful. And really credit goes to you because you were a mentor of mine. You didn't even realize it.
Oh, I did.
In the way that you forge and organize information. And there were others. But Mastery is where I learned to do that. And this is not a podcast. It's a sales pitch for Mastery. But gosh, it really taught me, okay, I have a graduate advisor. She was wonderful and brilliant, but she didn't know how to explain a lot of things to me. So I'd find someone else for that.
Right.
And someone else for the other thing, and someone else for the other thing. And together create a patchwork of really excellent mentors that made a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think there's a role for that process that you spell out in Mastery in the larger context of like who to become as a person, and that includes masculine and feminine ideals.
Yeah, and it's an ongoing process throughout your life. So who you glommed onto when you were 14 or 15 will change when you're 19. I had a series of people like you're talking about. My high school English teacher who had an enormous impact on me, who taught me basically how to write. I internalized his voice. When I went to Berkeley, I had a professor there who became my kind of surrogate father at Berkeley, who I deeply admired for his level of scholarship. So he became kind of an intellectual role model. Later in life, when I finally wrote my first book, I met a man, Joost Elfers, who was a book packager, who understood the business, etc. He kind of saved me. He was sort of my mentor for the next phase in my life. So on and on and on, I found people. But they have positive qualities that I admire. They're not perfect. Everyone is flawed. And so at some point, maybe you see too many of the flaws. You go on, I need somebody new in my life. But there's nothing wrong with that. It's not like you're violating any codes or hurting them. You move on to somebody else. But the sense of finding people whose qualities you admire, we don't learn from people just by following their ideas. We pick up their energy, their spirit. Now, you didn't necessarily pick up my energy or spirit from reading Mastery, although maybe you did, I don't know. But when you're interacting with that professor at Stanford or whatever, it's not just verbally, there's kind of a nonverbal communication going on. You're internalizing some of the positive qualities that you saw in them and finding these series of mentors, because I call it surrogate parents. You can't choose your father and mother, but you can choose these ideals for you. You can choose these mentors in your life. You can kind of rewrite your family history and find that father figure you never had by glomming onto this person. But it has to be the right fit. It has to be someone that you connect to emotionally and intellectually, and that has the positive qualities you wish for yourself.
Well, I'll embarrass you perhaps by saying that since I was a freshman in college, which is really when I turned my academic life around and really my life around, I've maintained the same notebook with a list of names of people that I admire and who I'm, trying to emulate in some way, not in every way, certainly. And certain names have been crossed off, but most of them have survived. And certainly after reading Mastery, your name made that list. And
I hope I'm not being crossed off at some point.
No, not at all, not at all. And through reading Mastery, there were additional names. I had the great misfortune